Donald Glover has revealed that he secretly suffered a stroke while on tour in 2024, collapsing with severe head pain and blurred vision before doctors in Houston told him what had happened. Medical scans then uncovered something even more horrifying, a hidden hole in his heart that required multiple surgeries, while he was also dealing with a broken foot and crushing exhaustion. The combination led to a cascade of health failures that didn't just threaten his tour, they nearly killed him. After months of treatment and recovery, Glover says he's stable now and finally healthy again. In 2002, 21-year-old Angela Walker and her brother attacked 32-year-old Canadian tourist Derek Rogers on a beach in Maine, reportedly knocking him unconscious and stuffing sand into his airways until he suffocated. Walker later lied to police about what had happened, before pleading guilty to manslaughter and perjury and receiving 10 years in prison. More than 2 decades later, in 2025, she was elected to the Bangor City Council, an outcome that drew outrage from the Rogers family and revived public attention towards the brutal killing. An elementary school outing in British Columbia turned into absolute chaos on November 20th, 2025, when a grizzly bear suddenly charged a group of 4th and 5th graders from a wall to school as they paused on a riverside trail. 11 people were injured during the attack, including 2 children who were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, while 7 others were treated at the scene. Teachers fought the bear off with bear spray and a bear banger, likely preventing multiple deaths. The bear soon escaped back into the forest and has still not been found, and officials say they don't know what triggered the attack or whether the animal will strike again. What's especially unsettling is that the attack happened to a group large enough that grizzlies normally avoid entirely, suggesting something was deeply wrong with the monstrous animal. And until conservation officers track it down, the entire valley remains on edge, knowing an injured and unpredictable grizzly bear is still lurking somewhere in the shadows. Did we cross a minute yet? We did. We did? Okay. So, why are we still going? This is real footage of the most dangerous object humans have ever created, the elephant's foot inside the ruins of Chernobyl. It looks like a lump of rock, but it's actually corium, a molten mixture of uranium fuel, concrete, steel, and reactor parts that fused together when Reactor 4 tore itself apart in 1986. When this mass formed, it was so radioactive that standing near it for a mere few seconds delivered a fatal dose. In those first few hours, the elephant's foot wasn't just deadly to anyone who approached, it was still hot enough chemically and thermally that if it had burned through the foundation and hit the water reservoirs beneath the plant, it could have triggered a massive steam explosion. Soviet scientists warned that the blast would have torn open the remaining reactors and sent an uncontrollable cloud of nuclear fallout across most of Europe, rendering entire countries uninhabitable. The only reason that didn't happen is because liquidators, many of whom died horribly later on, managed to drain the water and seal the lower levels in time. Early attempts to photograph the elephant's foot were catastrophic. The radiation shredded camera film and interfered with electronics, leaving warped, blistered images where the object barely looked real. Simply entering the corridor meant almost certain death for the human body. The footage shown comes from 1996, 10 years after the accident, where the radiation had dropped just enough for a brief, tightly controlled visit. But it was still extremely dangerous. By then, the mass was emitting mostly alpha radiation, particles that can't penetrate skin yet become lethal if even a single speck is inhaled. The team used ventilation, masks, and moved quickly, knowing the room was still one of the most radioactive places on the planet. Nearly 4 decades later, the elephant's foot remains where it formed. It's much cooler now, but still too radioactive to touch, too heavy to move, and too toxic to ever be safely dismantled. It stands as a permanent monument to a disaster that nearly poisoned half a continent. These men were just arrested for planning something absolutely horrific. Gavin Weisenberg and Tanner Thomas of North Texas were arrested after federal investigators uncovered their deranged plan to sail to a Haitian island, massacre every man living there, and turn the women and children into sex slaves. Court documents say they weren't just fantasizing. They were buying a sailboat, gathering weapons, recruiting homeless people as soldiers, and even running crude training drills in rural Texas where they practiced ambushes and mock executions. Prosecutors say they mapped out the island on Google Earth, drafted a post-conquest government, and talked openly about executing the men, breeding the women, and raising enslaved children, all while one of them was coercing a minor into creating explicit material. The FBI foiled the plot before they could leave Texas, but the indictment describes a plan so violent and delusional, it reads like a real-life blueprint for a modern-day genocide. They now face up to life in federal prison if convicted of the conspiracy charge, and up to 30 years for the charges relating to CP. Alright, this David case is getting out of hand crazy at this point. So if you haven't been following, 15-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez went missing in August of 2025, and after several weeks with no sightings, her body was discovered on September 8th inside the front trunk of an abandoned Tesla registered to musician David in the Hollywood Hills. She was wrapped in plastic, dismembered, severely decomposed, and the medical examiner couldn't immediately determine how she died or how long she'd been dead. Now the newest details reveal that her remains had actually been frozen before being placed in the car, and that's a major problem for investigators. Freezing and thawing a body destroys bruising, masks injuries, washes away blood patterns, and can literally erase the signs that tell examiners whether someone was beaten, stabbed, strangled, or died another way. After the body was frozen, it then sat in the Tesla for 2 to 4 weeks, thawing and decomposing while wiping out whatever forensic clues were left. David hasn't cooperated and remains a suspect but still hasn't been arrested yet because the autopsy is incomplete and prosecutors can't file major charges until the cause of death is confirmed. The freezing detail is why investigators are now struggling to determine when she died, what was done to her, and who handled her body in the weeks she was missing. David's upcoming tour dates, album promo, and public appearances have all been canceled as the case remains under investigation. In 2020, Megan Thee Stallion survived an attack that left her bleeding in the street, shot in both of her feet as she tried to walk away from a late-night argument. Bullet fragments tore into the back of her left heel and scattered through the soles of both feet. Injuries so deep that surgeons couldn't remove all the shrapnel, and pieces are still lodged inside her body. The man she identified as the shooter was later convicted and sentenced, but Megan has said the worst part wasn't the pain. It was being viciously mocked online by people who insisted she was lying, exaggerating, or milking the incident while she was recovering from gunshot wounds. In 1910 Los Angeles, a woman named Miss Bell had been searching for her missing Scotch Terrier for weeks when her friend G.E. Seawright stumbled upon the answer by pure nightmare coincidence. The man was having a hot dog for lunch when he suddenly bit down on something hard, a small metal object hidden deep inside his meal. When he fished it out and wiped it clean, he immediately froze. Stamped on the metal was the identification number of Miss Bell's missing dog. Only then did he realize the horrific truth. The dog had somehow been cooked into the meat of a local hot dog stand. In 2017, 22-year-old YouTuber Pedro Ruiz III tried to film a stunt where a hardcover encyclopedia would stop a .50 caliber round from a Desert Eagle. He had already tested the trick once before with a smaller gun, giving him the confidence to try it again, this time asking his pregnant girlfriend Mona Lisa Perez to fire from just a foot away. But the .50 cal round tore straight through the encyclopedia and into his chest, killing him instantly as 2 cameras recorded the stunt and their 3-year-old daughter stood nearby. Family members later said they'd warned him these viral stunts would get him killed. Perez pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 180 days in jail, and their unborn son was later named after Pedro. In Tampa, Florida, a long-lost cemetery quietly vanished from records for nearly a century, until a local newspaper traced old land deeds and realized a public housing complex had been built directly on top of it. When archaeologists scanned the ground with radar, they found over 100 graves still buried under the apartment complex in perfectly neat rows. The housing authority later confirmed they wouldn't disturb the bodies. Instead, they began relocating residents and announced plans to turn the land into a memorial park for the forgotten dead. This man swore he discovered the secrets of the pyramids and then built something that shouldn't be possible. Coral Castle in Homestead, Florida is a massive stone structure built single-handedly by Latvian immigrant Edward Leeds Skalman between 1923 and 1951, using more than 1,100 tons or 2.5 million pounds of oolitic limestone. Ed stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed about 100 pounds, but managed to carve, lift, and position multi-ton blocks entirely on his own, often at night and without witnesses, sparking decades of speculation about how he moved such massive stones without any machinery. Visitors swear the site feels engineered with impossible precision. One of its stone gates, weighing over 8 tons, can spin freely with the push of a finger. Ed always claimed he had discovered the secrets of the pyramids, but never explained his methods, leaving behind perfectly balanced stone doors, astronomically aligned carvings, and walls heavier than cars. Coral Castle remains one of America's most mysterious handmade monuments, built out of obsessive heartbreak after Ed's fiancée canceled their wedding just a day before the ceremony. Misty Lohman's viral mugshots came in the midst of years of personal and medical collapse. Before these images were taken, she had endured the losses of 3 infants in a short span, 1 miscarriage, 1 stillborn, and 1 that died shortly after birth, and she soon turned to drugs to cope with the unimaginable grief. At the same time, her health was unraveling from lupus, bone cancer, and scleroderma, a disease that thins and tightens the skin and can drastically change a person's appearance. As her condition worsened, she was arrested repeatedly for low-level drug charges, including possession, paraphernalia, and failure to appear in court, producing the series of shocking mugshots that later spread online without context. In the years since, Misty has entered long-term treatment, has been sober for 5 years, and now speaks openly about her medical conditions and the losses that shaped her life, pushing back against the misinformation and cruel insults that followed those photos. Here's some incredible footage of a black tiger marking its territory, one of the rarest big cat mutations on Earth. These so-called black tigers aren't truly melanistic, but carry a genetic glitch that thickens their stripes and darkens their coat until they look almost entirely black. Only a handful of them have ever been documented, nearly all from India's Similipal Tiger Reserve for reasons unknown to researchers across the world. Seeing a rhino with its full horn intact is becoming increasingly rare due to poaching. So many rhinos have been killed for their horns that conservation teams now remove them preemptively, making a full-grown one extremely uncommon. This colorized footage of Jerusalem in 1897 is the closest thing we have to a working time machine. This rarely seen deep-sea creature known as an oarfish washed ashore in Mexico earlier this year. Oarfish normally live thousands of feet beneath the surface and can grow up to 30 feet long, which is why their sudden beachings have fueled legends across the world for centuries. Their serpent-like bodies have inspired old nautical tales of sea monsters, and in Japan they're known as messengers from the sea god, believed to appear before major disasters. 3 elderly Holocaust survivors who were tattooed only a few numbers apart at Auschwitz were photographed together decades later, meeting as free men after building long, fulfilling lives. The nearly consecutive numbers on their arms, once marks of dehumanization, now stand as powerful proof of their resilience during a genocide. Here's a team of therapy dogs at a children's hospital in Italy, patiently sitting outside of their patients' rooms, excitedly waiting for their turns to go in. Trained for calmness, comfort, and gentle interaction, the dogs bring terminally ill children a moment of relief that medicine alone can't provide. A 71-year-old New Jersey man named Bill Sumil was heading home from dialysis when he told his Uber driver, 33-year-old Army veteran Tim Letts, that he was in desperate need of a kidney transplant. Instead of just offering sympathy and moving on to his next passenger, Tim gave him his number and volunteered to be tested as a donor. Weeks later, doctors confirmed he was a match, and Tim followed through, donating one of his kidneys to save the life of a passenger he'd met by chance. The surgery was successful, and both men are now friends for life. 20-year-old Macy Williams spent her final night the same way she'd spent most of her life, putting everyone else first. The trouble reportedly began when a friend pressured her to go out, snuck her into a bar, and pushed her to drink far more than she could safely handle. As the night went on and Macy became increasingly disoriented, she still ended up driving that friend home. Macy repeatedly asked if she could stay at the friend's house instead of trying to make it back to her own, but the request was denied. Not long after leaving the house, around 4 a.m. on September 20th, 2025, Macy's car collided head-on with a semi-truck on a highway in Knoxville. The impact was so severe that first responders said there was nothing that anyone could have done. Her death devastated her friend group, who described her as the mom friend, the one who protected everyone else before herself. On May 2, 2001, John Battaglia lured his 2 daughters, 9-year-old Faith and 6-year-old Liberty, to his Dallas apartment for what was supposed to be a routine visitation, even though he was already wanted for violating probation after threatening their mother, Mary Jean Pearl. Furious that she had reported him, he called her on speaker and forced the girls to the phone so that she could hear everything. As Mary Jean begged them to run away, Faith's last words were, "No, Daddy, please don't do it," followed by the sound of multiple gunshots. Battaglia shot both girls with a .45 caliber revolver, then calmly left the apartment, went to a tattoo shop, and had 2 roses inked on his arm to honor them. When police arrived, the girls were found posed and surrounded by their toys. Battaglia showed no remorse at trial, smirked at the prosecutors, and even blew kisses at spectators in the courtroom. He was sentenced to death and eventually executed in 2018, calling himself the happiest man alive moments before the injection. Grace Van Dien, aka Chrissy, revealed that she was groomed by a producer while working on another project, an experience she said left her traumatized enough to step away from acting entirely. She described it as one of the darkest times of her life, saying Hollywood had become unsafe for her and that the incident permanently changed how she views the industry. Before Stranger Things, Brett Gelman endured years of darkness, losing his younger brother in a sudden tragedy, spiraling through severe depression, and battling suicidal thoughts while he struggled to afford rent and avoid homelessness. He says he was quietly blacklisted in Hollywood for speaking out against abusive workplaces, leaving him convinced his career would be over before it ever started. Mark Steger, the performer inside the Demogorgon suit, has said the role was one of the most physically dangerous of his career. The practical suit trapped extreme heat, restricted movement, and weighed so much that he repeatedly suffered heat exhaustion, ligament strain, and even collapsed during takes. At one point, he collapsed so fast the crew thought he'd gone into cardiac arrest. Steger said the Demogorgon required total body endurance just to survive filming days. This was the shocking moment her family realized they'd made a horrific mistake. In Thailand, a 65-year-old woman who was presumed dead stunned mourners when she suddenly started knocking from inside her coffin just moments before cremation. Her family had believed she'd passed away after appearing to stop breathing 2 days earlier, so she was transported hundreds of miles to a Bangkok area temple for her funeral. But just as monks were preparing the cremation rites, staff heard faint thuds coming from the coffin and opened it to find her alive, barely moving, eyes fluttering, and severely weakened from critically low blood sugar. Temple workers later said the knocking was so faint they almost dismissed it as part of the ritual drum sounds, meaning she was seconds away from being burned alive without anyone noticing. The discovery sparked outrage over how she was declared dead without a medical exam, and how close she came to cremation after laying unconscious in a sealed coffin for 2 days. She was rushed to the hospital and is now in stable condition, recovering under medical supervision after narrowly surviving her own funeral. Just last week, 26-year-old Bethany McGee was riding the Blue Line in Chicago when a stranger walked up, poured a flammable liquid on her, and set her on fire. Police say 50-year-old Lawrence Reed didn't say a word before igniting her, then chased her through the train car as she burned and screamed. She soon stumbled out of the train with devastating, life-threatening burns while other commuters simply watched in horror. Reed was arrested minutes later and hit with federal terrorism charges, and that's when the most infuriating details began to surface. Court records show he'd been arrested at least 72 times over 3 decades, including assaults, arson, attacks on social workers, and other violent charges, yet was still out on electronic monitoring at the time of the attack. Prosecutors even revealed he had a pending aggravated battery case from earlier this year for attacking a hospital employee, showing a pattern of escalating violence that no one managed to stop. Bethany's friends later described her as a gentle, soft-spoken woman, an honor student, an animal lover, and someone who greeted everyone with kindness, making the randomness and brutality of the attack even harder to comprehend. The case has sparked national outrage over how someone with a rap sheet that long was free to carry out such a horrific attack, while Bethany remains in critical condition. During World War II, Nazi SS units carried out one of the regime's most disturbing programs, the mass kidnapping of up to 200,000 Polish children for forced Germanization. After being taken from their families, the children were sent to SS-run children's education camps, where they were subjected to horrific racial selection exams. SS doctors measured their skulls, noses, eye colors, and body proportions, trying to determine whether each child looked Aryan enough to be turned into a German. If a child passed the test, they were renamed, stripped of their identity, and adopted into German families as if they'd never been Polish at all. But if they failed, their fate was much darker. Many were transported to concentration camps, where countless children died from starvation, disease, abuse, or execution. Only an estimated 10 to 15% of the kidnapped children were ever found and returned to Poland after the war. At the Nuremberg trials, the Allies confirmed the program a form of genocide, the deliberate attempt to erase an entire population by stealing and remaking their children. This is the last known photo of Freddie Mercury before his death in 1991. In order to avoid the attention, Freddie denied rumors about having AIDS until the day before he died. During the Middle Ages, it was believed that sperm produced from the left testicle resulted in having a girl. So to ensure having a son, men would often have their left testicle removed in a painful surgery. In the 1960s, Canadian woodsman Francis Wharton shot a deer and made dentures out of its teeth. He then proceeded to eat the deer with the deer's own teeth. A cat named Oscar correctly predicted the deaths of over 50 patients at a nursing home in Rhode Island. Soon after he arrived at the home, staff noticed that Oscar chose to nap next to patients who would die a few hours later. Nurses would sometimes even place Oscar next to patients they thought would die, but he would move to other patients and be correct every time. North Korean founder Kim Il-sung had a baseball-sized tumor on the back of his head that propaganda officials worked hard to hide. As a result, this is one of the only photos ever taken of the tumor. This disturbing drawing was created by a nonverbal dementia patient in a nursing home. A hitchhiking robot that relied on the kindness of strangers to travel the world made it safely across Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands. But just 2 weeks into its American tour, Hitchbot was found in Philadelphia with its arms and head ripped off. An 18-year-old girl from Alaska was encouraged to murder her best friend by a boy she met online who claimed to be a multimillionaire. She then convinced 4 others to help her so that they could split a $9 million prize. It ended up being a total scam perpetrated by a mentally disabled man from Indiana. The assassin bug wears the corpses of its prey like a backpack. After stabbing its prey and slurping out the innards, the insect uses the corpses as armor and camouflage. In 1991, Patricia Stallings was sentenced to life in prison for poisoning her child with antifreeze. She then gave birth to a second child while in prison, who was given to a foster care. But he eventually became sick with the same symptoms as the first child, indicating a rare metabolic disorder, not poisoning. This proved her innocence and she was released. When Mary Ann Bevan was 32 years old, she was a beautiful nurse who was happily married with 4 children. But all of that changed in 1906 when she began suffering from acromegaly, a disease that doctors couldn't quite understand at the time. Mary was experiencing migraines and joint pain that turned into abnormal facial growth and distortion. Within 5 years, she looked like a completely different person and saw her beauty continue to fade with each day. Due to her ugliness, she was eventually fired from her job, and in 1914, her husband Thomas died from a stroke, leaving Anne and the 4 children behind. Desperate to feed her kids, Anne decided to enter a contest and won the offensive title of Ugliest Woman in the World. She was offered a job at Dreamland Circus in Coney Island, where she endured daily ridicule for 13 years until her death in 1933. In 2017, a Utah woman was murdered by her husband while on a murder mystery-themed cruise in Alaska. Many of the passengers thought that the screams coming from their cabin were all just part of the show. Within 3 days of dying, the bacteria in your stomach that digested your food will begin to digest you. Sent to a German mental hospital in 1907, Katharina Drexel made a husband doll out of straw. It's said that she brought the doll everywhere she went, interacting with it as if it were a living person. In 2015, a Scottish farmer reported seeing a car crash on the side of a highway. It took police 3 days to respond, and by the time they did, they found Lamara Bell in critical condition next to her dead partner. She would succumb to her injuries 4 days later due to the negligence. The details revealed in Michael Jackson's autopsy report were nothing short of disturbing. He was almost completely bald and had a number of cosmetic tattoos, including permanent eyeliner and lip liner. He had puncture wounds all over his arms and had nothing but pills in his stomach at the time of death. Michael had also undergone at least 10 nose jobs, leaving him with a left nostril that was almost completely collapsed. In 1963, the Bronx Zoo had an exhibit called The Most Dangerous Animal in the World. The entire exhibit was just a mirror. Serial killer Richard Chase once attempted to enter a woman's home but walked away after realizing her doors were locked. Chase later told detectives that he took locked doors as a sign that he wasn't welcome, but that unlocked doors were an invitation to come inside. A man named Martin Pistorius once endured a 12-year coma even though he was completely aware of his surroundings. He could see and hear everything, including his mother saying she hoped he would die. But he couldn't show any signs of consciousness and was completely trapped with nothing but his thoughts. In 1965, a machine was patented to deliver a baby using centrifugal force. The machine would spin the woman until the baby came out, and he or she would be caught in a net. In Switzerland, public restrooms are lit with blue lights so that junkies can't find their veins. This is an example of an underground dungeon called an oubliette in Warwick Castle. Prisoners were often dumped in these extremely narrow passages and forgotten about until they starved to death. Many of these dungeons were also placed under privies, meaning the prisoner would be the recipient of all the human waste in the castle. A 42-year-old British woman received over $70,000 in donations after setting up a GoFundMe to fund her cancer treatment. But it turned out she was a total fraud and was instead using the money to fund her lavish lifestyle and gambling addiction. When Disney released Princess and the Frog, it caused a minor salmonella outbreak across the country. Over 50 kids were hospitalized after kissing a frog. The heaviest human ever recorded weighed 1,400 pounds at his peak. He once lost over 900 pounds, only to gain it all back later in life. Contrary to what was reported at the time, Ronald Reagan lost more than half his blood and came within seconds of dying when he was shot in 1981. His true condition was concealed from the public for nearly 30 years. In an average lifetime, human skin completely replaces itself more than 900 times. A Russian woman named Kristina Ozturk is addicted to having kids and vows to have over 100 by the time she turns 30. She's only 23 years old and already has 11 kids with her 56-year-old husband. In 1967, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov became the first person to die in space. His craft had over 200 known flaws, but his attempts to delay the flight were rejected. Had he refused the mission, his friend Yuri Gagarin would have been sent instead. Vladimir specifically asked the authorities to give him an open casket funeral after the mission. In the famous first edition of Playboy, Hugh Hefner published nude photos of Marilyn Monroe without her permission. He later purchased the crypt beside her even though they'd never met in life, and now he's buried next to her. The Great Smog of London in 1952 was so bad that pedestrians couldn't even see their shoes. It resulted in the deaths of 4,000 people, many of whom fell into the Thames River and drowned simply because they couldn't see it. In 1998, Tom and Eileen Lonergan were left behind during a diving trip in the Great Barrier Reef. It took 2 days for anyone to even notice before an extensive search was launched. 6 months later, their closing gear washed up along with a dive slate that read, "Please rescue us before we die." Their ultimate cause of death remains unknown since their bodies were never recovered. As part of a fundraising publicity stunt in 1986, United Way released 1.5 million balloons in Cleveland, Ohio. But the event resulted in utter disaster since the balloons clogged various waterways and even shut down an airport. They also interrupted a Coast Guard search for 2 missing boaters who were later found to have drowned. As a sign of mourning, ancient Egyptians would often shave their eyebrows when their cats died. David Gaines earned 5 bachelor degrees at the same time at the University of Connecticut, but he sadly drowned and died just a few months after graduating because he never learned how to swim. If you ever have a kidney stone, just take a ride on Thunder Mountain in Disney World. After hearing rumors, a Michigan urologist took kidney models filled with stones on the ride. He found that the stones were passed up to 70% of the time depending on where he sat. 19-year-old Australian Sam Ballard was a star rugby player until he was dared to eat a garden slug at a team party. The slug ended up infecting him with a condition called rat lungworm, which paralyzed him and eventually killed him 8 years later. In 2014, it was reported that Kim Jong-un killed his own uncle by throwing him into a cage filled with hundreds of stray dogs. In one of the most horrifying cases of human captivity, Joseph Fritzl imprisoned his own daughter Elizabeth in a hidden basement beneath their Austrian home for 24 years, beginning in 1984. He repeatedly tortured and raped her, fathering 7 of her children, 3 of whom were raised in the underground dungeon without ever seeing daylight. The space was initially built as a bomb shelter and had no windows, was soundproofed, and could only be accessed through a series of hidden electronically locked doors that Fritzl installed himself. The monster kept up a front by convincing authorities and his wife that Elizabeth had joined a cult, even forging letters to support the lie. But the case was exposed in 2008 when one of the captive children fell critically ill and was brought to a hospital, prompting an investigation. Fritzl was arrested, convicted of many awful crimes, and sentenced to life in a psychiatric facility. The dungeon was later sealed with concrete, while Elizabeth and her surviving children were placed under new identities. This photo, taken in 1995, shows a young boy carrying his dog while crossing the infamous Sniper Alley in Bosnia. During a 4-year-long siege of the capital, Serbian snipers targeted civilians to instill terror among the population. The siege resulted in the deaths of over 11,500 people, including more than 1,600 children, and left tens of thousands wounded. Children were shot while riding bikes, fetching water, or simply staring out the window, turning daily life into a death lottery. The boy's fate after this photograph was taken remains unknown. In 1994, British Parliament member Stephen Milligan was found dead in his London home under bizarre and scandalous circumstances. His body was partially dressed in women's lingerie with a plastic bag over his head, a cord around his neck, and a slice of orange in his mouth. His death was ruled as accidental, likely the result of autoerotic asphyxiation. Around 5000 BC, a man sat down in the harsh climate of Chile's Atacama Desert and has remained in that position ever since. The extreme dryness of the region naturally mummified the remains, leaving the skin, hair, and clothing astonishingly intact after more than 7,000 years. In other words, he's been chilly in there for a long time. Actor Daniel Hovels accidentally slit his own throat on stage during a 2008 theatrical performance after his prop knife was somehow switched out for a real one. The audience initially thought it was all just an elaborate special effect. The blade had just barely missed Hovels' carotid artery, but he was back on stage the next day. The leading cause of death for pregnant and postpartum women in America is homicide. This is often driven by partner violence that is escalated or triggered by the pregnancy, stemming from jealousy, fear of responsibility, and financial stress. In 2014, a crematorium in Virginia caught fire during the cremation of a 500-pound body. The excessive body fat caused the furnace to overheat, igniting the building's roof. A Florida musician known as Prince Midnight constructed a fully functional electric guitar he dubbed the Skelecaster, using the skeletal remains of his deceased Uncle Philip. Philip had donated his skeleton to a medical college in Greece, but after 2 decades, the school no longer had any use for them, so the remains were returned to his family. Prince Midnight decided to honor his uncle, who introduced him to heavy metal music, by turning his ribcage, spinal column, and pelvis into a guitar. Juana Barraza, known as the Little Old Lady Killer, was a Mexican professional wrestler who murdered at least 16 elderly women in Mexico City between 1998 and 2006. She posed as a social worker to gain access to her victims' homes, then strangled them, often with cords or her bare hands, and stole their belongings. Her strength and wrestling background, performing under the name the Lady of Silence, made her attacks especially brutal. Panic gripped the city as authorities struggled to solve the case until she was finally caught fleeing a murder scene. Barraza later confessed a deep resentment toward her abusive mother and was sentenced to 759 years in prison. Vlad the Impaler earned his name through the methodical terror he inflicted on his enemies. When the mighty Ottoman Empire invaded his territory in 1462, they were met with a nightmarish sight: a forest of 20,000 impaled corpses mounted on tall wooden stakes and left to rot beneath the scorching summer sun. The victims, captured soldiers, peasants, and anyone who defied Vlad, including children, were arranged with chilling precision, their decomposing bodies spreading a stench of death for miles. Upon seeing this grotesque display, Sultan Mehmed II was so disturbed that he ordered his army of 100,000 men to retreat. While filming Jackass No. 2, Johnny Knoxville attempted a motocross backflip that went horribly wrong when the bike crashed down handlebars first directly onto his crotch. Knoxville was immediately rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered the trauma had torn his urethra and partially detached it from his bladder. For the next 3 years, he had to perform painful self-catheterization twice daily to keep the torn tissue from sealing shut. He later described the sensation of pushing a tube through the raw, unhealed tissue as like jamming a knife into an open wound every single day. The risk of infection was constant, and any mistake could have led to permanent urinary dysfunction or worse. In 1912, 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar vanished from his family's tent during a camping trip in Louisiana, sparking a frantic 8-month search. He was eventually found in Mississippi with another family who insisted that he was actually their son, Bruce Anderson. But sadly, the Andersons didn't have the money to fight this in court, so they lost custody of the child. The Dunbars took the boy home and raised him as their son Bobby Dunbar for the remainder of his life. Decades later, in 2004, DNA testing confirmed that the boy they took from the Andersons was not Bobby Dunbar, as the real Bobby Dunbar's fate remains unknown to this day. Actor Gaten Matarazzo, who plays Dustin in Stranger Things, was born with a rare genetic condition called cleidocranial dysplasia, affecting the development of bones and teeth. The condition left him without collarbones, caused severe dental issues, and required multiple painful surgeries. He was initially rejected from acting roles due to his appearance and speech, as his future in entertainment looked quite grim until Stranger Things incorporated his condition into the character. In more severe cases, CCD can lead to skull malformations, fragile bones, and life-threatening complications. Gaten now uses his platform to raise awareness and support others living with the condition. Nanny Doss was a seemingly sweet, smiling woman who murdered at least 11 members of her own family between the 1920s and 50s. Her victims included 4 husbands, 2 children, her own mother, 2 sisters, 2 grandsons, and a mother-in-law, most of whom died mysteriously in their sleep or after sudden bouts of illness. Doss used arsenic-laced foods, poisoned drinks, and other subtle methods to kill, often collecting the insurance money of the victims after murdering them. When she was finally arrested in 1954, she giggled through her confessions, earning her the nickname the Giggling Granny. Pop icon Claude Francois, often hailed as the French Elvis, met a gruesome end in 1978 when he tried to fix a flickering light bulb while standing in a bathtub filled with water. The 39-year-old received a severe electric shock that immediately fried his internal organs and stopped his heart. A family preparing to bury a loved one was shocked to find that one of the burial plots they had purchased was already occupied. Despite extensive efforts, no one could determine who the mystery individual was or how they ended up buried there. Rather than exhume the remains, the family decided to let the unknown person rest in peace, marking the grave with a headstone that simply read, "Random Person." In the 1960s, the CIA was looking for creative ways to spy on the Russians without being noticed. That's when they came up with the genius idea to use a cat to record Russian conversations. A veterinary surgeon implanted a microphone in the cat's ear and a radio transmitter at the base of its skull. The plan was for the cat to be released near a Soviet embassy and innocuously record any dialogue amongst the men. But after 5 years of research and $20 million in funding, the cat was struck and killed by a taxicab almost immediately. A French woman was scammed out of 830,000 euros after falling for an elaborate scheme involving an AI-generated version of Brad Pitt. It began in 2023 when someone posing as Pitt's mother contacted her online, followed by Brad himself claiming he was battling kidney cancer and desperately needed financial help or else he was gonna die. He sent AI-generated hospital photos showing himself bruised and hooked up to machines. Over time, the woman was manipulated into believing they were in a secret relationship, one he swore had to be kept quiet because of restrictive Hollywood contracts. She even believed they were engaged and that he planned to move to France to marry her. She wired him thousands for fake medical bills and customs fees for luxury gifts that he sent her but never arrived. After her husband divorced her over the delusion, she sent the scammers 775,000 euros she received from the settlement. Despite repeated warnings, she insisted it was true love until she eventually realized she had thrown her entire life away for a fake person. A poor spider that was posthumously named Lawrence got stuck in this glass and couldn't climb up the smooth surface. So it apparently tried to web its way to the top until its silk ran out and it eventually perished. In 2020, Russian influencer Yekaterina Didenko's 29th birthday celebration at a Moscow pool complex turned tragic when approximately 55 pounds of dry ice were poured into the swimming pool. Intended to create a fog effect, the dry ice produced a massive amount of carbon dioxide gas upon making contact with the water, leading to suffocation and chemical burns among attendees. 3 people ended up dying as a result, including Didenko's husband, who succumbed to his injuries in the hospital. In 2005, Thomas Montgomery, a 46-year-old married man from New York, created an online persona named Tommy, presenting himself as an 18-year-old Marine. Using this catfish, he began an online relationship with a 17-year-old girl from West Virginia named Jessie. But Montgomery's coworker, 22-year-old Brian Barrett, also became involved with Jessie online. When Jessie started shifting her attention to Barrett without him having to catfish her, Montgomery became consumed with jealousy. Eventually, Montgomery ambushed Barrett in their workplace parking lot and shot him 3 times with a military-style rifle, with 1 bullet piercing his neck as he sat in his car. Tommy was later arrested and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, receiving 20 years in prison. But the story didn't stop there. In a final shocking twist, it was revealed that the teen girl they'd both been obsessed with was actually a 45-year-old housewife who was using her daughter's photos to catfish men online. In 2002, New York City bartender Sean Doyle was out drinking with his friend Michael Wright when a drunken argument suddenly broke out after Wright accused Doyle of flirting with his girlfriend. In a fit of rage, Wright threw Doyle down an open manhole and he immediately started screaming in agony from below. The shaft led down to a steam tunnel where a ruptured vent had caused the water temperature to reach an estimated 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Doyle survived the fall and was pleading for help while trapped in the boiling water, but the heat and steam were far too intense for rescuers to reach him. Witnesses reported hearing his screams echoing through the streets like a whistling tea kettle, then abruptly stopping. His body was finally recovered 4 hours later, and the medical examiner later described the scene as one of the worst she'd ever seen. The metal of his belt buckle had partially fused with his pelvis, and steam had filled up his lungs until they completely ruptured. His skin had completely peeled away, and his organs were essentially steamed like a lobster. In 2012, a freak accident saved this woman's life in the craziest way possible. 42-year-old Donna Barber was at a family gathering in Arkansas when her teenage son accidentally shot her straight in the neck with a bow and arrow. The arrow pierced the side of her throat just inches from her carotid artery, close enough that she could feel her pulse pounding against the shaft. For a moment, Dawn remained standing in shock before collapsing in a pool of her own blood. As her family screamed in panic, some believing they'd just witnessed her death, she was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. But during emergency scans, doctors made a chilling discovery. Nestled deep in her neck, not far from the arrow's path, was a cancerous tumor growing in her thyroid. It hadn't caused any symptoms yet, and without the arrow, it likely would have gone unnoticed until it was far too late. Surgeons carefully removed the arrow then the tumor in a single surgery, and Dawn miraculously went on to make a full recovery. In August of 1993, 4-year-old Derek Roby had been walking alone to summer camp when 13-year-old Eric Smith lured him into the woods under the guise of showing him a new shortcut. Once they were out of sight, Smith strangled Derek until he was unconscious, brutally smashed his head with a large rock, then poured Kool-Aid into the boy's wounds. Before fleeing the scene, Smith removed one of Derek's shoes and scattered the contents of his lunchbox all around him, creating a disturbing and almost ritualistic display that baffled investigators. The child's body was found later that day, just yards from the park he never made it to. Smith later confessed and was tried as an adult despite his young age, receiving 9 years to life in prison. He was denied parole 10 times over the years, with Derek's family attending each hearing to oppose his release. After 27 years behind bars, Smith was finally granted parole in 2022, sparking debates about whether someone capable of such violence at 13 can ever truly be reformed. In the summer of 1974, 18-year-old Disneyland cast member Deborah Gale was assigned to the newly opened America Sings ride in Tomorrowland, a rotating theater that featured animatronic animals singing songs from different eras of American history. The attraction had only been open for 9 days when something went horribly wrong during her shift on July 8th. At some point during the rotation, Deborah became caught in a narrow gap between a moving theater wall and a stationary platform. As the mechanism turned, she was crushed in the machinery, likely killing her immediately. Guests seated nearby heard her screams followed by a loud thud, but tragically mistook both for sound effects from the show. In 2009, a member of Al-Qaeda attempted to assassinate Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Nayef by hiding a pound of explosives inside his anus, an unprecedented tactic at the time. Disguised as a remorseful militant surrendering during Ramadan, the terrorist was allowed close access to the prince and even passed through metal detectors without detection. Once face to face, he detonated the device, but his own body absorbed most of the blast, killing him instantly while only slightly injuring the startled prince. Adult star Faye Reagan appeared in over 400 films before vanishing into obscurity following her 2014 retirement. Her life quickly spiraled into constant legal troubles, hard drug use, and homelessness. On May 7th of this year, she mysteriously disappeared from East Charleston Boulevard in Las Vegas, a corridor infamous for crime and desperation. Last seen wearing green sweatpants and carrying a backpack, Reagan has not been seen or heard from since. Photographer Sam Davis captured the incredible moment a snake eel burst out from a heron's stomach while the bird was still flying, having chewed its way through the heron's throat using its pointed tail. Both animals were likely fatally injured. In the 90s, Disney planned to open a theme park called Disney's America near the Civil War battlefields in Virginia. A Disney executive said the park would let visitors feel what it was like to be a slave. Amid intense public outrage and political pressure, Disney ended up scrapping the disastrous project. In 2018, Demi Lovato was found unconscious in her Los Angeles home after ingesting a mix of heroin laced with fentanyl. Her assistant discovered her unresponsive and thought she was already dead since her skin had turned blue. Paramedics administered Narcan to save her life, but what followed was far worse than most people realize. Lovato suffered 3 strokes, a heart attack, and severe brain damage due to a prolonged lack of oxygen from the overdose. She was legally blind for several days and still has blind spots in her vision which affect her ability to drive. She had developed organ failure and placed on dialysis as doctors told her she was only minutes away from death. Even after surviving, her motor skills were severely damaged and she had to relearn how to walk. Demi later admitted that she had asked her dealer for heroin but was instead given fentanyl without her knowledge. Lovato has since spoken openly about the trauma, referring to the near-death experience as the biggest wake-up call of her life. Celine Dion lost both her husband and brother to cancer within the same week in 2016. She performed shortly after their deaths, later saying the stage was the only place she didn't feel pain. In 2021, a 45-year-old man named Thangula Satish died in India after his rooster, armed with a 3-inch blade for an illegal cockfight, slashed his groin as it tried to escape, severing a major artery and causing him to bleed out before he reached the hospital. The rooster was briefly detained at a police station before being transferred to a local farm. In 1974, the mutilated body of a woman was found neatly placed on a beach blanket in the dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts. Her hands were missing, her teeth removed, and her skull was crushed on one side, yet her hair was styled and her toenails painted. Known for decades only as the Lady of the Dunes, her identity remained a mystery despite widespread speculation. Over the years, she was linked to escaped convicts, mob enforcers, and even a missing extra from the film set of Jaws. Finally, in 2022, nearly 50 years later, forensic genealogy identified her as 37-year-old Ruth Marie Terry from Tennessee, and her husband, a conman with a dark past, was named the likely killer. Beloved by millions, Latina singer Selena was on the verge of global superstardom when cracks began to show behind the scenes of her fame. One of her most devoted fans, Yolanda Saldivar, had pushed her way into Selena's inner circle, first as president of her fan club, then as manager of her boutiques. But what began as genuine admiration eventually spiraled into obsession and control. Yolanda grew possessive, isolating Selena from others, and was soon suspected of embezzling money. In March of 1995, Selena met her at a Corpus Christi motel to retrieve crucial financial documents. Backed into a corner and fearing exposure, Yolanda pulled out a revolver and shot Selena in the back as she tried to leave. Selena managed to run nearly 400 feet to the lobby, leaving a trail of blood behind her before collapsing. With her final breath, she named her killer as Yolanda Saldivar, the woman who was once her biggest fan. During a pro wrestling tag team match in 2015, Rey Mysterio delivered a routine dropkick intended to set up his signature 619 move against Perro Aguayo Jr., but Aguayo slumped lifelessly onto the ropes. Unbeknownst to everyone at first, Aguayo had suffered a fatal cervical spine injury, likely caused by the whiplash to his neck from the dropkick. The match eerily continued on for several minutes before anyone realized that something was seriously wrong. Aguayo was soon rushed to the hospital, but was pronounced dead shortly afterwards. The cause of death was later determined to be cardiac arrest, due to a cervical stroke caused by 3 fractured vertebrae. The coroner stated that the fractures took place at 2 different moments of impact and that Aguayo died almost immediately. Although Mysterio bore no blame, the incident left him devastated since Aguayo had been his longtime friend. It remains one of the only times a pro wrestler died during a match from in-ring trauma. When Steve Burns suddenly left Blue's Clues in 2002, dark rumors quickly began to circulate, including claims that he had vanished in a tragic accident or died from a heroin overdose. In reality, he simply felt that it was time to move on as he began balding and could no longer see himself on a children's show. The day after filming his final episode, Steve shaved his head and stepped away from the cheery world of Blue's Clues, retreating into obscurity to pursue a somber indie music career. The death hoaxes that followed weighed heavily on him, intensifying his struggles with depression and casting a long, unexpected shadow on the legacy he left behind. In 2002, reclusive hoarder Bruce Andrew Roberts shot and killed an intruder who had broken into his home. Instead of reporting the incident, Roberts hid the body in a spare bedroom, covered it with a rug, and used over 70 bottles of air freshener to mask the smell. He lived alongside the mummified corpse for 15 years until it was finally discovered during a cleanup after his death. At age 43, French journalist Jean-Dominique Bauby suffered a bad stroke and became paralyzed. He ended up being diagnosed with the nightmarish condition of locked-in syndrome, where his mind was fully intact, but he couldn't move any part of his body except for one of his eyelids. Bauby eventually blinked out a 130-page novel that was a bestseller, passing away just 2 days after it was published. Creator of Naruto Masashi Kishimoto endured a grueling work schedule that pushed him to the brink of physical and emotional collapse. He routinely worked up to 20 hours per day, leading to several hospitalizations, and even missing the birth of his own child due to crushing deadlines. By the final arcs of Naruto, he admitted to feeling emotionally numb, simply trying to survive the demands of the series. Writing certain death scenes took a drastic personal toll on him, and he received constant death threats from fans over controversial plot decisions. Much of his work was inspired by feelings of deep isolation and insecurity, stemming from his youth and the constant comparisons to his twin brother. These personal struggles bled into Naruto's themes of loneliness, rejection, and the desperate need for acknowledgement. In 1992, Pepsi launched a promotion in the Philippines called Number Fever, offering 1 million pesos to anyone with the winning bottle cap number, a life-changing prize for most people in the country at the time. On May 25th, the winning number announced was 349, but due to a printing error, over 600,000 caps with that number had been distributed. Thousands of people thought they had won, only to be told their prizes wouldn't be honored, and chaos quickly ensued. Riots broke out, Pepsi trucks were bombed, and at least 5 people were killed, including a mother and her child when a grenade was thrown at a delivery truck. Pepsi offered small consolation payments, but the damage was done. The scandal became one of the most infamous marketing disasters in history, and Pepsi never fully regained public trust in the Philippines. Morbid Facts, Part 141. Female mummies in ancient Egypt were always more decomposed than their male counterparts. Researchers would later discover that this was because male bodies were embalmed a lot sooner than female bodies. Unlike male bodies, female bodies were kept at the family home until they started to decompose. The only reason this was done was to prevent the embalmers from getting weird with the bodies. Children who are victims of hot car deaths are often found with large portions of their hair ripped out. The only reason dogs love squeaky toys is because they sound like little animals dying. Every unborn baby grows a mustache in the womb, which then spreads to cover the entire body. The baby then eats this fine hair called lanugo, then excretes it after birth with their first bowel movement. Morbid Facts, Part 144. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary Vincent was hitchhiking in California when she was picked up by 56-year-old Larry Singleton. The man eventually knocked her out with a sledgehammer and sexually assaulted her that night. The next day, he cut off both her arms with a hatchet and threw her into a ditch to die. But Mary managed to pack her stumps with blood to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually made it to the highway and started walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in horror. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon who picked her up and she survived. Singleton was sentenced to 14 years in prison but was released 6 years early due to good behavior. He would go on to murder a different woman named Roxanne Hayes a few years later. Morbid Facts, Part 145. In 1903, Topsy the elephant was executed by poisoning, strangulation, and electrocution. A 74-second video of the electrocution was recorded and preserved by Thomas Edison. It may have been the first time ever that death was captured in a motion picture film. In 1854, a 13-year-old boy died in San Francisco after a circus clown swung him around by the heels. A Frenchman named Tarare was famous in the 1700s for his endless appetite. He was reported to have eaten live snakes, cats, lizards, and puppies. In one case, he ate a meal intended for 15 people in a single sitting. While being treated in a hospital for his condition, he was caught trying to drink other patients' blood and eat corpses from the morgue. After being suspected of eating a toddler, he was ejected from the hospital. Morbid Facts, Part 147. In 1991, Patricia Stallings was sentenced to life in prison for poisoning her child with antifreeze. She then gave birth to a second child while in prison, who was given to a foster care. But he eventually became sick with the same symptoms as the first child, indicating a rare metabolic disorder, not poisoning. This proved her innocence and she was later released. In a Mexican prison in 2020, two rival drug cartels decided to have a friendly soccer match. Things must have gotten out of hand pretty quickly since the match ended with 16 people dead. In 1975, it was revealed that the CIA had developed a heart attack gun that fired a dart of frozen water and shellfish toxin. Once inside the body, it would melt, leaving only a small red mark on the victim. The official cause of death would always be a heart attack. Morbid Facts, Part 149. While getting into character for the Jobs movie, Ashton Kutcher tried Steve Jobs' diet, but he ended up in a hospital because it messed with his pancreas levels. It's likely no coincidence that Steve Jobs died from pancreatic cancer. Albert Einstein's last words were lost forever because he said them in German, which the nurse attending to him did not speak. The disclaimer of no animals were harmed during the making of this film isn't always true. It can be put on movies even if animals died during the production, as long as cameras weren't rolling at the time. The Heart Attack Grill is a restaurant in Las Vegas where people weighing over 350 pounds can eat for free. 3 people have died while eating there, and the only vegan option on the menu is cigarettes. Morbid Facts, Part 150. In her Firefox search history, Casey Anthony had foolproof suffocation methods from the day before her daughter died. But police overlooked this evidence because they only checked her search history from Internet Explorer. Throughout his life, Ernest Hemingway survived malaria, anthrax, pneumonia, dysentery, skin cancer, diabetes, hepatitis, a ruptured kidney, spleen, and liver, a crushed vertebrae, and a fractured skull. He also survived 2 separate plane crashes in a 2-day span while on an African safari. In 2013, a French businessman died of a heart attack while having an affair with a stranger during a company trip. A French court ruled that this was an industrial accident and that his wife and family were entitled to compensation. Morbid Facts, Part 151. The death of Metallica singer James Hetfield's mom inspired him to write the song The God That Failed. She died when he was 16 due to Christian beliefs influencing her to reject cancer treatment. In 1999, a waitress was tipped a lottery ticket and won $10 million. She was then sued by her colleagues for their share. Afterwards, she was sued by the man who tipped her the ticket. Then she was kidnapped by her ex-husband and ended up shooting him in the chest. Lastly, she went to court against the IRS for more than a decade before finally winning. In 1825, painter Samuel Morse received a letter which read that his wife was sick. The next day, he received a new letter which read that she had died. 2 days later, he went to see his wife one last time only to discover she had already been buried. Distraught over the slowness of long-distance communication, he invented the Morse code. Morbid Facts, Part 152. In 1977, Bob Marley was diagnosed with skin cancer on his toe and was told that having it amputated would stop the spread. But he refused the surgery since his Rastafarian religion saw amputation as a sin. By summer of 1980, the cancer had metastasized throughout Marley's entire body, and he died soon afterwards. When 2-year-old Rosalia Lombardo died from the Spanish flu in 1920, her grieving father insisted on her being preserved. Known as the Sleeping Beauty, she was one of the last to be buried in Sicily's Capuchin catacombs. This photo was taken in 1982, 62 years after she died. In the year 2000, a partially paralyzed old man was in his outhouse when the floor suddenly collapsed. He fell through and was immediately surrounded by excrement, spiders, maggots, and rats. He was stuck for more than 3 days until his mailman thankfully found him. Morbid Facts, Part 153. In 1996, a man from Texas was bitten by the highly venomous coral snake. But instead of panicking, he killed the snake by biting off its head before using the snake's decapitated body as a tourniquet. Venezuelan serial killer Duranhel Vargas confessed to killing and eating at least 10 individuals. But he claimed he never ate fat people because he thought they had too much cholesterol. A British bomb detection dog named Theo died from stress a few hours after watching his handler get shot. The pair had set a record for bomb detection, and the dog was posthumously awarded an honor equivalent to the Victorian Cross. In 2019, a Spanish woman gave her neighbor a box full of sex toys to hold on to. 6 months later, the neighbor noticed a horrible stench coming from the box. She finally opened it and found a decomposing severed head. It was the head of the original woman's husband. Morbid Facts, Part 155. 5 hours before he was confirmed to be dead, somebody posted about Michael Jackson's death on Wikipedia with nearly exact details. No one paid attention because everyone thought it was just a prank, so no details about the original poster were ever found. While masks may save human lives, the same can't be said for wildlife. In 2020 alone, an estimated 1.5 billion masks ended up in our oceans. A British teenager was arrested after beating and stabbing 2 girls because they called him Harry Potter. In 2009, a man sued Pepsi when he was traumatized after finding a mouse in his Mountain Dew. But Pepsi attorneys said this was impossible since Mountain Dew would completely dissolve a mouse in 30 days. Pepsi won the case upon showing that the can was purchased 74 days after it was manufactured. Morbid Facts, Part 156. In 1979, the King of Persia ordered the execution of 2 servants for being too loud. But since it was a holiday, he postponed their executions by 1 day and made the servants return to their duties. That night, they assassinated the king in his sleep. The FBI estimates that there are between 25 and 50 active serial killers in the US at any given time. When a person is executed by electric chair, they feel everything. They are fully aware of their bodies being fried as it happens in real time. One inmate who survived the first round of electrocution said it tasted exactly like cold peanut butter. A Japanese schoolgirl once died because a teacher crushed her head in the school gate. The principal said it was the student's fault because the gate had to be closed at exactly 8:30 and she was late. Morbid Facts, Part 157. When Bono was 14, his mother suffered an aneurysm at her own father's funeral and later died. Bono said the grief in his heart at the time was a big part of why he turned to music. A German shepherd named Tommy attends Mass every day at his local church in Italy. This is because his owner had her funeral there and he hopes that one day she will return. Australian vegan Maria Stridham wanted to prove that vegans can do anything by climbing Mount Everest. Sadly, she died while descending as a result of severe altitude sickness. In 1929, 2 scientists at Princeton University successfully turned a live cat into a telephone. They connected its auditory nerve to a transmitter, and when one researcher spoke through the cat's ear, the other could hear it through the receiver. The experiment was viewed as groundbreaking and led to the invention of cochlear implants. Morbid Facts, Part 158. This is a photo of Princess Diana consoling Elton John at the funeral of Gianni Versace. Just over a month later, Diana would die in a car accident and Elton would perform at her funeral. Jean Calment lived to the age of 122 and was the oldest living human in history. She smoked cigarettes for 96 years from the age of 21 and only decided to quit 5 years before she died. If you're ever bitten or scratched by a wild animal, go get a rabies shot immediately. The way rabies kills, once you show symptoms, there's no way to treat it and you will almost certainly die. In 1957, a woman attending an MLB game was hit with a foul ball that broke her nose. The game was briefly paused and resumed once the woman was put on a stretcher. As they carried her away, the very next pitch was fouled off and hit the same woman, breaking a bone in her knee. Morbid Facts, Part 159. If you don't want wrinkles but would prefer to stay away from Botox, this woman has a solution for you. To avoid wrinkles, Tess Christian claims to have not laughed or smiled for more than 40 years, even after the birth of her daughter. The individual animal with the most human kills ever was a tiger from northern India. After a tooth injury from a gunshot left her unable to hunt normal prey, she adjusted her hunting style to go for humans instead. She was shot and killed in 1907 with an estimated 436 human kills. Jeannie Wiley was locked in a room for 13 years by her father, who wanted to protect her from the outside world. He kept her tied in a straitjacket and would bark at her like a wild dog if she made any noise. When she was finally rescued, doctors said she had the cognitive abilities of a 1-year-old baby. Morbid Facts, Part 163. This is why saturation diving is one of the highest paying jobs in the world. In 1983, 4 rig workers were working deep in a diving chamber in the North Sea. When one of the men opened a hatch too early, the chamber quickly depressurized and dropped from 9 atmospheres of pressure to 1 in less than a second. All 4 men were killed instantly as the pressure was so explosive that it caused 3 of the divers' blood to flash boil. The 4th diver wasn't any luckier as he was forced through a small opening and violently torn apart. According to the autopsy, all of the organs of his chest were launched out of his body and projected upwards more than 30 feet. All of the men likely died immediately, but the investigators were never the same after discovering such a gruesome scene. Morbid Facts, Part 164. Kim Jong-un travels with his own toilet to prevent his excretions from falling into the wrong hands. The waste contains important information about his health status and can't be left behind. In the 1960s, the CIA spent $20 million on a cat equipped with gear to spy on the Soviets. Sadly, the operation was cancelled when the cat was hit and killed by a taxi almost immediately. A 115-year-old woman from Nepal has been smoking at least 1 pack of cigarettes per day since 1920. She claims that smoking has aided in her longevity and that all the doctors who advised her to quit have already died. Morbid Facts, Part 173. Within the walls of Alcatraz, Al Capone's brain completely melted due to untreated neurosyphilis. It got to the point where he would throw his feces at the other inmates and was paroled early because he was deemed too much of a lost cause to be a threat. When he died at the age of 48, he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. While Charles Darwin is famous for his work on evolution, he also killed and tasted every species of animal that he discovered. As many as 3 U.S. presidents, as well as Abe Lincoln's son, likely died as a result of contaminated water in the White House. Until 1850, there was no sewage system and a field of human excrement called night soil flowed freely into the water supply. Morbid Facts, Part 178. This photo was taken by a paramedic in 2015 outside of a hospital in California. It shows an ER doctor who stepped outside to cry for a moment after losing a 19-year-old patient. Minutes later, he walked back in the building with his head held high and continued on to his next patient. In the 1940s, Mike the Chicken lived for 18 months after his head was axed off. He only died after choking on a kernel of corn. In 2010, Mexican singer Sergio Vega publicly denied a news report that he had been murdered. Hours later, he was murdered. A Massachusetts man named Kenny Waters was wrongly imprisoned for 18 years for murder. He was finally freed in 2001 after his high school dropout sister went to law school to prove his innocence. Just 6 months after he was released, he died in a freak accident. This is the unbelievable anatomy of conjoined twins Brittany and Abby Hensel, who are now 32 years old. Notably, they have 4 lungs but 1 rib cage, 2 hearts, 1 liver, 2 stomachs, 1 set of intestines, 3 kidneys, and 1 pelvis. This is an example of a pillory which was used as a form of capital punishment in 19th century China. The man in the photo can't reach his hands to his face, so he must rely on pedestrians to give him food and water like a dog. The device also made it incredibly hard to sleep comfortably, essentially torturing the prisoner until they died from starvation. In 1999, Martin Lawrence collapsed from heat stroke while jogging in heavy clothing to prepare for his role in Big Mama's House. He recovered in the hospital after entering a 3-day coma on a ventilator due to his body temperature reaching 107 degrees. This map published by FEMA shows the potential U.S. targets in a nuclear war scenario. If you're from the Northeast like me, you might want to start building that bunker. Here's a photo of 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. being led to the room in which he was executed in 1944. He was given the electric chair after being convicted of murdering 2 white girls in South Carolina. The all-white jury determined he was guilty after only 10 minutes of deliberation, and he became the youngest person to be executed in U.S. history. Stinney was exonerated 70 years later after a court finally recognized that he'd received an unfair trial. In 1991, a decomposing woman was found hanging from a shower in a New Mexico motel room. Despite an image of her being found in the room, she and the man in the photo still remain unidentified to this day. Her first name is believed to be Becca, only thanks to an anonymous tip given to police in 2021. The animal that causes the most deaths in the US annually is deer. This is due to them blindly running into roadways, resulting in an estimated 200 deaths per year. The runner-up is bees, wasps, and hornets, accounting for around 60 deaths annually. Tennessee man James Washington was always the prime suspect of a 1995 murder, but there was never sufficient evidence to charge him. That was until 2012 when he was having a heart attack and confessed to the murder since he believed he was on his deathbed. But he ended up recovering and was convicted based on this confession, which he later tried to take back. Bubble boy David Vedder was born with a severe immunity disorder where he basically had no immune system at all, meaning even the most harmless germs could easily end up killing him. Because of this, he spent his entire life inside of a bubble and could only receive air, water, and food if it had been sterilized first. At age 12, David received a bone marrow transplant from his sister, the only treatment available that would allow him outside of his bubble. But the marrow sadly contained traces of a dormant virus, and David passed away a few months later. Kidam Cave in Kenya is believed to be the original source of Ebola and Marburg, two of the deadliest diseases known to man. A 2007 expedition found evidence that the vector species was most likely the African fruit bat, or more specifically, their guano. Either way, the cave is known to scientists as one of the most dangerous places on the planet. After Carrie Fisher passed away in 2016, her ashes were placed inside of an urn shaped like a giant Prozac pill. The giant pill was apparently her favorite possession since it was a reference to her battle with bipolar disorder. This famous mummy appeared to be satisfying himself during his final moments in 79 AD. To Catch a Predator was canceled in 2008 after a Texas district attorney took his own life when he was exposed as a child predator by the show. The entire scene was captured by an NBC camera crew that entered his home. In medieval Germany, a divorcing couple could legally settle their disputes with a marital duel. The man was given a weapon but had to fight out of a hole with one hand tied behind his back, while the wife could move freely with the rock-filled sack but had to wear weighted clothing. If the husband lost, he was beheaded. But if the wife lost, she was buried alive. Actor Joaquin Phoenix grew up in a cult called Children of God, which reportedly praised pedophilia. His parents even traveled to Venezuela to recruit followers, but have claimed they were unaware of any child predation. The family changed their last name to Phoenix to symbolize their new life after leaving the cult. Due to the skin's elasticity, it would take 3 full rotations to completely remove the human head. Don't ask how I know that. For the average adult, there are about 10 pounds of organisms living in and on you that are exclusively not you. There was a form of medieval torture where the victim's feet were covered in salt and a goat would start licking them. Known as tickle torture, it would become extremely painful once the skin was worn away by the rough tongue of the goat, creating a wound with salt slowly trickling in.